Today I'll be reading the story called The First Encounter. Here we go. The stories are handed down from one generation to the next. The Western Shoshone learned about their culture and past history. Here's a personal account of one's family's first encounter with the Europeans. This story has been handed down through 5 generations of their family. This story takes place near Battle Mountain, Nevada. At one time, the mountains were entirely covered with pinyon pine trees, but a huge fire had wiped out the area, and the trees never grew back. At dusk, the family continued their harvesting of pine nuts in the mountains west of the Battle Mountain area. The father was distracted as he worked, because earlier that morning, he saw a large cloud of dust down on the flats along the Humboldt. He watched it come closer and closer, fearing that it may be a large war party. He was concerned for the safety of his family. Finally, he told his family that it was getting too dangerous to stay and work any longer. He needed to go see who was coming and if it was one of their enemies. Then they needed to leave the area, head south towards their main camp. He took them and hid them in a small cave in the mountains and told them to stay there all day. If he didn't come back by nightfall, they were to leave the area and find their people in the south. He covered up the opening with rocks, leaving a small breathing hole. He camouflaged the rocks by putting large bushes in front of them and erased any remaining traces. They listened as he ran down the mountainside. The family waited all day, making no sounds. They could not hear or see anything. It started getting dark. They stayed even though it got later and later. They did not want to leave their father there, without knowing what had happened to him. But come dawn, assuming he had been killed, the family decided that if they did not leave, they might end up like their father. Saddened and fearing for their lives, they quickly left the area, moving south. As they were journeying south, they heard someone coming. They immediately hid themselves, only to find that their father had caught up to them. He was hungry and thirsty, having ran all the way. After eating, he recounted the frightening scenes he had seen down at the Humboldt River. He had run all the way down to the river area. Circling around the group, he came up from the rear to follow them. At first, he could not understand what kind of animal could make tracks like these. It looked as if 2 snakes were moving in perfect rhythm together. The closer he got, he recognized men on horses. He knew what horses were, since he had seen those obtained by other tribes and bands. But what scared him was that these men were pale, with hair all over their faces. At first, he thought they were sick, but after watching them throughout the day, he knew they were healthy. Then he saw their wagons and knew that the house that moved on the round wood was what had made the tracks in the dirt. He knew they were hunters because they hunted the beaver along the river. He was astonished by the waste they made. They did not eat the meat. They did not eat all the meat or use the bones, but just threw it away except for the hides. He saw them kill their animals with a shiny stick that made a thunderous sound. He stayed into the evening, watching them set up their camp, cook, and entertain themselves. He said they cooked their food in a black rock over a fire, and they made strange sounds when talking. He could not understand them. They also made strange sounds by rubbing 2 wooden objects. He thought they were singing, but it sounded more like laughing. It did not sound like any singing he had heard. He stayed there until the strangers went to sleep, and then he quietly stole away. He knew his family was already gone, so he ran until he could catch up to them. Scared and very confused by what they heard, the family continued south, moving as fast as they could, not knowing that this encounter would only be the first contact they would have with the strangers that had come into their lives. And that is the story of the first encounter.